And get this started. All right, good afternoon, folks. Just to reiterate Lorenzo's welcome. Thank you for taking the time today to join the webinar. We're going to be covering how to use Corelight data powered by Splunk to help with threat hunting exercises, right? And today we're going to get into and provide an overview of Corelight and how that data is generated, where the sensor is instrumented, and we'll get into how easily we can get that the extracted data into Splunk using the embedded Splunk forwarder on the appliance. Then we'll get into a hands-on lab, kind of exploring the Splunk, the Corelight application within Splunk, do some data exploration and security workflows. And then we'll get into two use cases around threat hunting. We'll look at some exfil, possible exfil within a network. And then we'll kind of dive deep into a trick bot use case as well to kind of do our threat hunting based off of SSL certificates and self-signed certificates. And then at the end there, we're going to kind of do and look at and see how we can start eliminating alert fatigue by automating some of these tasks using Splunk Phantom. All right, so let's see here. Threat hunters need access to a myriad of different data sources to include host and network level data. Splunk indexes all this data so they can provide fast results. The key as a responder is to get answers quickly to your hunting questions, answers to your hunting questions answered quickly. Now that you have a rich set of data, you can build playbooks to automate tasks using the Splunk Phantom. We'll get into how Corelight data can help with playbooks to help relieve the dreaded alert fatigue. This in turn will free up some more time for hunt exercises. And when instrumented correctly, the network provides a trusted source of highly relevant data. The host level data is good. However, once an actor gets control of the host, they have the ability to cover their tracks by manipulating the data. This is highly unlikely with the network. So we have a lot of protocols that can be decoded and hundreds of data elements. And Corelight provides value by extracting high fidelity layer 4 and layer 7 metadata that is then forwarded into Splunk for searching and indexing. The key for us is that both the request and response is in a single log entry. So you're not moving around different points in the data set. All of the data is available for you. And this is done and linked through fields for easy pivoting of multiple log entries. And we'll kind of get into the details of that later on in the prezo. So both SourceFire and Tenable started out with an open source solution that they commercialized. Zeek and Corelight is the same deal. Dr. Vern Paxson developed Zeek 25 years ago out of Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. It's a great open source solution that provides visibility into your network data. We have seen that over the years, the challenge with open source has been performance and manageability. Most implementations are only able to get at most 3 gigabits of performance utilizing the open source solution. Corelight can scale the performance up to 25 to 30 gigabits of sustained performance. So we overcame the performance problem and provide a centralized management suite. So Corelight has commercialized Zeek, but the key difference is that we still maintain and manage the open source project as well. So Corelight is very actively involved in the project, but our solution is starting to split and bifurcate where we are adding intellectual property on the Corelight side, but still using Zeek as the core engine. So Corelight helps organizations to consolidate their passive network security stack. There are too many passive sensors working independently. Corelight provides an integrated sensor capable of providing IDS, NTA, PCAP, and NPM, or network performance monitoring, which is greater than the sum of its parts. Corelight provides a network traffic analysis engine using Zeek, which is the industry standard for IR and threat hunting. IR teams rely on Zeek to provide a deep and comprehensive visibility of network traffic. Couple this with the signature-based alerts from an IDS or the IDS module, alerts enriched with the powerful network metadata of Zeek. The enriched alerts can be quickly and accurately analyzed. So no more fumbling around the UI and trying to figure out where to find this data. It's all going to be stitched together. Since the sensor is extracting metadata from the network stream, you can get smart about your full packet capture strategy. With the integrated sensor, you can reduce your PCAP data by up to 90% by capturing packets that are relevant to your organization. This will provide a more efficient use of PCAP resources, allowing for longer retention times and/or a reduced footprint. And of course, all of this data is being forwarded into Splunk for analysis. This provides a single pane of glass for the analyst. No need to learn a point product that may not get used very often. They're familiar with the interface of Splunk, and thanks to their common information model, they can continue using common fields that they've already used to. Right. So this is a typical deployment from a sensor standpoint. As you can see, it is completely passive. The sensor is getting a copy of the traffic off of the network. It's going into your packet broker fabric. And then from there, it's getting forwarded into the Corelight sensor. And we've this here kind of indicates the various form factors that are available from Corelight. We've got Corelight cloud sensors that have the ability to run in AWS or Azure and monitor that traffic. We've got physical sensors that support anywhere from a couple of gigs all the way up to 25 to 30 gigs. And then there's also virtual sensor and a software sensor. Right? So as the data is coming in, the metadata is getting extracted out. And then we do have two other inputs into the platform. We've got the Intel feeds up top here, which you could either subscribe to third-party feeds or have your internal feeds that can get pushed into here. And as the data is being analyzed, we can enrich it and get any matches off of the Intel feeds. So in that case there, we're applying your Intel in a real time and raising notices based off of those hits. Right, and then down here from the input framework, right? So this is to help you enrich the metadata with your CMDB. So if you have particular servers or server farms that are of critical resources, we can tag those within the logs to allow the analyst to quickly determine and identify what the hosts are within that particular log. Right. And then, of course, as we mentioned before, all of that metadata that is getting extracted out is getting forwarded into Splunk. And the sensor is running a licensed Splunk forwarder within the platform. And we can either use a deployment server, a Splunk deployment server, to download the configuration into the Splunk forwarder. We can upload it via the API within the sensor for the configuration piece of it, but pretty straightforward, just to click and enter the data, and we'll kind of get into that later on. All right, and then the logs are getting pushed into Splunk, and you have the ability to, at that point, have that data within the single pane of glass. The solution also provides the capability to extract files from the network data. right? And these files, it's not all or nothing. You can actually specify and say, hey, I don't want to see all files extracted. You can limit it by their MIME type and say, hey, just any either executables and maybe some PDFs, but text files I'm not really interested in. Those can get extracted out, pushed over to some network storage, and then you can point those into some dynamic file analysis tools, the various ones listed here.
And cool on. Something to bring up here is sort of this life cycle. Am I coming through clear?
Perfect, go for it.
Awesome. So like so far you can see the data is coming in off of the wire and then it's gone through Corelight, so it's extracted, the metadata is extracted and it goes to Splunk for an analytic. But there's also these other integration boxes that are around, and Kulwan touched on a couple of components there, but also think about the aspect of where things do go to like file analysis tools there on the bottom right where he just left. And you actually tease out artifacts or pieces of information from your investigation, or when you're triaging of a particular event, you can use that information back into the platform to then identify other components that are going on inside of the environment. You can then take that information, put it back into Splunk, and find maybe other hosts or systems that are affected, not infected, but affected by whatever campaign or scenario is happening inside of the environment. So all of this can really be tied together in sort of a full loop. And I think we're going to touch on some of that as we talk about the playbooks when we move forward. Go ahead, Kulwan.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, and we're actually going to be, that's going to be part of the walkthrough in the hunting exercise. We're going to actually utilize that. All right. So what is this data that Corelight supposedly is able to produce, right? So basically what ends up happening is Corelight is generating multiple logs, and the core of, at the core of this is the ConLog, right? And if we kind of click into it, so as soon as Corelight sees the first SYN packet within the network, it's going to automatically generate this particular log right here, which is a ConLog. It's going to input the timestamp along with a unique ID, and then it's going to have the 5-tuple, right? Your source, destination, addresses, and port numbers, as well as the protocol, right? And then as the connection progresses and it goes through the three-way handshake, right? So even if the three-way handshake does not, the responding host does not respond back to this, this connection log still gets generated even on that initial SYN packet, or for that matter, even a UDP packet will generate one of these logs. Right. Now, once you do get a response back and it completes the three-way handshake, what it's going to do then, what Corelight sensor is going to do then, is it's going to start looking at the data that's being exchanged between the two hosts. And it's going to try to dynamically determine what is the underlying layer 7 protocol that this particular connection is trying to run, right? And at that point, what ends up happening is you get the detected application protocol gets populated, all right? And this is a sample of what a ConLog looks like within Splunk. So you've got the connection state. So this gives you that three-way handshake and the connection teardown. It'll actually show you whether it was gracefully created and gracefully terminated, right? And then obviously you've got your normal layer 4 information. And then up here, you've got your, down here, the service. So this particular connection was DNS at layer 7. Right, and then we also are able to put in the originating country code as well, and the respondent country code. Right, so at this point, the ConLog has figured out what type of layer 7 service is running. And with the ability to tie in these logs using the unique ID, right, once it determines that the underlying traffic is, for in this case, SMTP, what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and create another log called the SMTP log. While still it's maintaining the connection log, for the bytes in and out. It's going to go ahead and create this one here. And now what it's going to start doing is going to start pulling out some of those layer 7 data. Right? So in this case here, it's going to pull out the from address, the to address from email. Obviously, if it's encrypted, you know, that's a whole different story. But as long as it's in the clear, we're able to pull this out. And then it's going to pull out the subject as well as the user agent. And this is an example of that particular log within Splunk. And keep in mind, what you don't see here, and this kind of indicates the extensibility of this platform, but we can actually, there's a parser, an add-on to the SMTP logs, which scans the body of the email looking for any embedded URLs. And these embedded URLs are taken out, extracted out, and appended to this particular SMTP log. So if you've got, you know, if you find in your environment, you get an alert for a malicious file being downloaded because somebody clicked on their email link, well, there's actually going to be, you have the ability to go back to the source of that link, right? Where you can just do a search for that particular URL. And you should be getting hits both on the HTTP logs as well as the SMTP logs.
Hey, and folks, given that we're with the chat window, go ahead, if you have questions, put them in the chat window, the broader chat window versus the Q&A panel. For some reason, we're not getting the Q&A stuff. So go ahead and feel free to fill in a question in the chat panel, and we'll answer it that way. If you have any questions, that is. Sorry to break your flow there, Coolwant.
No worries, no worries. This is all good. And then, so that's the unique ID, which ties in the various different logs. Then there's some other IDs. Remember I was saying that the solution has the ability to extract out files. So those files have individual IDs as well. So if we look at the files log, you know, once again, the ConLog will always be there, right? Once it figures out what that layer 7 application is, it's then also going to generate a layer 7 log. And in this case here, I'm jumping straight into the files log, but underneath here, it should actually have either an email, an HTTP, or an FTP or SMB for that matter, log being generated as well, because files don't just go willy-nilly across your network. They have to use an underlying transport. But with the files, you know, you get the connection ID to be able to link those, excuse me, clicked on the wrong one. And then this is a sample of that particular log, and you get information like the MD5. You get the actual file itself. You're also getting the MIME type, right? Now, keep in mind here, the MIME type is not just, you know, system is not just trusting what the MIME type was set in during HTTP or something. It's actually reconstructing that file on the fly. It's going to calculate the MD5 hash on that file while it's reconstructed. It's going to create the SHA-1 and SHA-256 hashes. And then it's going to do a libmagic lookup on the headers to figure out what is the underlying file, right? So here we got a file name that's, you know, a .gif. Well, that's an image file. But when you actually look at the actual file, it's an executable, right? And then if we go up here, you can see the various analyzers that were applied to this particular file, including the PE. The PE is the portable executable. So if it does see a portable executable, Corelight sensor is going to generate another log, which is the portable executable log, right? And this is going to provide you some static information about the executable itself, right? Things like what the compile, when it was compiled, right? Whether it's 64-bit and what operating system it was compiled for, and then give you some section names as well.
And to add some color too, like everything with a connection. So for everything that's flying over connectors, sort of like the de-onioning or the delayering, right? There's always a data section to each of these protocols, and this just expands. So even though it's not shown on the screen, you could have a connection log but inside the connection's HTTP, that's transport. Inside the HTTP stream is an object, a file object. That file object is a portable executable. So it's just this compilation and this de-abstraction, if you will, of all of the different metadata that we see. Now, combining it together and linking it together makes it very easy to pivot from one thing to the next and to ask questions of the data and get relevant answers because the data is actually there. There's some things here in this PE log. So the PE log is not it's not an antivirus. It's not a debugger. It's nothing like that. It's just giving you some static information. And all of this can be changed, but there's things like that uses DEP, data execution prevention, or does it have exception handling or vectored exception handling or other exception handling techniques that are involved. What's the import table look like? What are the section names, et cetera? So there is some relevant information here to just sum up or give some sort of credibility to maybe what this file object is. But to Coolwant's point, you have a file type mismatch right away. So that obviously looks suspect, but this gives you more information so you can start digging and then asking more questions of the data. What system was it on? What user was logged into the system? All of this gets sent up to Splunk to ask those questions of.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. All right. Oh, wow. Oh, well, I just messed up my flow here with my clicking through. Just give me 1 second.
You can't be hitting the backspace key. That doesn't work.
Yeah, that doesn't
no good.
work very well in slide mode.
But this is a good point to, I think, like take a step back and recognize that when you're conducting analysis, if you're a security analyst or you're an investigator or a threat hunter or pick the term, but you work in the security operations center, right? A lot of times you're trying to answer questions. You see an alert, you see an event, it doesn't have context. You want to understand what happened, what were the objects or the entities in the environment that were involved in this network communication. Coolwant had mentioned earlier that like on the endpoint, an endpoint can be compromised, and even if you conduct forensics, it's very tedious and timely to understand what happened. But when you go back to the network, even from a historical perspective, I mean, think about it. If you have an antivirus detection on a workstation now, is that like time zero, or can we go back in the past and see, wait a minute, we already saw that object, it's just the signature wasn't there on the AV 2 weeks ago. So you can go back to the network and see the network communication to and from the external world to where maybe that came from, or maybe how the individual came to be infected to begin with. So we want to be able to go to the network and tie those pieces together and stitch together that attack scenario. And we all know that attacks really come in multi-stages and multi-flows. And this allows us to do that with the different protocol analysis and seeing the endpoints and what have you. And with that, I'll pass it back to Coolwant to pick it back up.
No, thank you, Paul. All right, so that's so this is some more connection logs that are being generated. These are more kind of geared towards the Windows type of logs, or what you would most likely see in an east-west situation. I mean, outside of RDP, you wouldn't really, hopefully you wouldn't see any of these other protocols on a north-south connection. But we'll just kind of highlight and show the RDP one, right? And this is looking at that data, and you're able to pull out some pretty good nuggets with this particular log, right? Like keyboard layout. I know some IR folks have used that, to see, if you got some Chinese formatted keyboard in your network, should that be happening?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think it was either APT1 or APT28 as listed by Mandy, and I can't remember, I guess it was 28, but the Ukrainian keyboard was used for the attacks. If you look back at some threat reports and then you consider some of the artifacts that you can find using the network metadata, even though it's not a solid answer, right? Because anybody could use a different keyboard, but it points you in the right direction. You start to find those indicators, those things that relate maybe your threat actors together.
Right. Perfect. Yeah, and then you do the same thing with the encryption level as well to see if there's any unencrypted or if there's encrypted RDP within your environment, and kind of eliminate things there based off of that. Right. But basically, I mean, you're getting a good, rich set of data from simply a single deployed sensor. Right? So, and you get a myriad of different different logs. All right, so that's the stitching again. All right, so that's kind of the core functionality of getting those logs out. But the sensor also provides some insights into encrypted traffic. It has the ability to detect SSH scans and brute force attempts and highlight if it was successful. It will issue a notice log. So the notice log is another format of the log, which Zeek attempts to, or the Corelight sensor attempts to kind of call your attention to it. It's not doing a quote unquote saying, hey, this is bad. It's more of a, hey, this is something interesting, maybe you want to take a look at it, right? And that's what that notice framework is. But it has the ability to detect interactive sessions versus a scripted. So it can actually use and find out if there's actually a human behind there typing over SSH, even though it's encrypted. You just look at the way the packets are moving back and forth, or the way the data is moving back and forth.
Yeah, and it gets deeper. It gets deeper too, right? So I mean, you can look at the entire stage of what, you know, how do you stand up an SSH session, how you tear one down, what happens within it. Like if this is authentication, if this is password authentication, if this is using a certificate. When somebody's typing, you're getting an echo every time somebody types. So even though you don't know what was typed, you can see that there was typing. Data transfer is like huge moves of data over the actual pipe. So I mean, that obviously sounds like it seems kind of like a no-brainer, but from a protocol perspective, and you're looking at this data, you can make some observations and some inferences about what's happening inside the encrypted session. So this can get really deep, and with the world going to an encrypted model where we're seeing more and more encryption, and you apply the same concept to TLS, even though you can't inspect the data directly, you can make some observations about what's happening. It helps analysts make more choices using the other data elements as pointers to what could be going on. Sorry, I know I kind of hijacked that, but this functionality is a key component of Corelight moving forward, given that there's so much encrypted communication. Even with packet capture technologies, they capture all this encrypted communication, and there's not much value there with the exception of the stand up and tear down using certificates so you understand who the players are. Go ahead, go on, sorry.
That's perfect, Paul. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I wanted to highlight out here, right, is that certificate hygiene. One of the things that the notices log does identify are self-signed certs. And the reason I'm highlighting that, we're gonna kind of use that in our walkthrough of the demo. Right, and we kind of mentioned the Splunk Common Information Model earlier, but Corelight does support mapping of the Corelight fields into the standard Splunk Sim Fields, which makes it a lot easier for analysts or users that are used to seeing those fields, so they're not running new fields. And then it makes it easier to ingest this type of data into ML engines. Since it is normalized, you can use it within ES as well. Right, and I'm kind of running a little bit behind here, so we're going to try to speed it up here. I just got one more slide to go through before we kick over to the demo. But from a sensor export standpoint, right, it is as simple as creating an app on the Splunk deployment server. In the deployment apps, Etsy deployment apps, you just make this outputs.conf file with this particular data. Excuse me. And then with the server address of the Splunk and the TCP port, and then within the Corelight UI, this is probably the only time that you would go into the Corelight UI. There's really no reason to touch it unless you're doing some administrative work, because all of that data is sent into Splunk. So you would come in here and say export to Splunk, enable the deployment server, and put that data in there. For the deployment server, it'll go ahead and reach out and pull that app down and configure the forwarder. All right, so let's go ahead and Zeek the truth. All right, just give me a second while I go ahead and set up my lab environment. I just want to make sure I didn't get logged out. All right, so I'm going to be going back and, well, not going back and forth, but I just wanted to kind of look at our production Splunk instance that's looking at our production network in San Francisco at corporate. And basically, anytime you start a hunting exercise, you need to be able to go in and make sure that the data that you're seeing is trustworthy, right? That you're capturing everything. There's no what do you call it? There's no gaps in the data that's coming out, right? So you can easily come into the Corelight app, go under health and performance and look at the sensor overview, right? It'll give you an overview of the log rates. And as you can see, they're pretty stable, but they're pretty low, right? I mean, it's 20 logs per second. That's kind of low. And that's because everybody's sitting at home and not able to get into the office, right? Everybody's working remotely. So that's a little bit misleading here. But what we're going to do is go over to the demo environment, and we're just going to go into the search within Corelight app. And in this case here, we're going to, so when you're doing threat hunting, right, you start out with a particular hypothesis, right? In this case here, let's look at endpoints that should be downloading more traffic versus uploading, right? We'll utilize the producer-consumer ratio to look at some interesting traffic, right? So what I'm gonna do is opposed to...
Just like story time right here. So this is where I think there's like some setting the stage, right? We can start talking about like when you come to work, if you're a security analyst, what are the kinds of things that you normally go through? If you were dealing with alerts and events all the time and then trying to validate them, or you're a tier 1 analyst, tier 2, et cetera. But there's basically some different stages here. And right now, this is more like that hunt hypothesis. You came to work, you were thinking that we can identify something that maybe is a producer inside the environment that should be a consumer, or vice versa. You know, what are the things that are available, or what do I have in my environment to help answer that question? Right now, we took this pretty broadly here, but at the same time, given that the platform produces so much rich network metadata, Coolwant's going to be able to showcase how to answer that kind of question. And then, of course, it can be extrapolated from there and turned into an investigation.
Yep, and I'm just going to kind of go over how simple the query is. As you can see here, so we're looking at the connection logs from Corelight as the source type. We've got one of the fields is the destination internal to my network, right? Because you only want to look at traffic that is going out of your network. Right? And then we're going to make sure that there was actually some data set up, both going out and coming in. So we've got the recipient bytes and the originating bytes greater than 0. And then after this point, we're just utilizing some Splunk capabilities to kind of help us arrange this data and evaluate it, right? And then calculating the PCR here, or the producer-consumer ratio, what we're doing is saying, okay, the original bytes, the originating bytes that are going out, minus the response bytes coming back to my hosts, divided by those two values added up, right? And then it's taking a ratio of that. And basically what that's going to give you is a range from +1 to -1, where, you know, if you look at it from a +1, you've got more data going away from that particular host versus coming in. Right. And as I know, most of these hosts that are on here are not hosting any kind of services. And then what we're doing is, once we calculate that rate, then we're just displaying the data so I can find out who the hosts are internally, who the external host is, what ports they were communicating over, and what was the underlying layer 7 service that was being utilized. Right, and then of course I've got the UID and the amounts of bytes that were shown there, so we can make it easier to pivot, right? And
so like Coolwant's, yeah, I was going to say, as Coolwant's getting this together and he sort of explained that search query, I want to take it a step back for a second and just sort of talk about the application of this technique, right? So this technique is not specific to Splunk or to Corelight. It is something that came out of a conference called FlowCon back in 2014, I think somebody at the Software Engineering Institute of Carnegie Mellon put out a paper, so you can read about the actual like technique or concept of it, and then it was turned into a script that was deployed on Bro/Zeek, which is the underlying engine for Corelight. And now you can produce this PCR ratio, if you will, and use it in analysis. So that's where it actually comes from, sort of the history of this technique. And this is the application of it here that Coolwatt's showing.
Perfect. Yep. So here, what we're seeing is, okay, we got some of our normal SMTP traffic, some SSH, and then down here, we've got some unknowns that are using some fairly high port numbers. So this is actually not a service that's being offered up. They're actually going outside of the network to push up data. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of focus in on that particular IP address, do a new search. All right, and then if we kind of scroll down to the service, which gives us what that layer 7 information was. So that particular host, so we clicked off of the unknown. Now we're looking at everything that host was communicating over. And it's got some various DNS traffic. It's got HTTP traffic, as well as SSL in addition to that unknown. Right? What we'll do is we'll just kind of dive in to the unknown there. So we're just going to click through on the unknown. And if we look at the responding IPs, the responding hosts, we got a fairly, I wouldn't say a lot, but there's a lot of them, right? There's about 42 total numbers. These are the kind of the highly shown ones. But a majority of the traffic is going to this 95.211.138.72 address. So what we're going to do now is we can kind of dive into that a little bit more. All right, we'll go ahead and take a look at and see what other external IP addresses this guy was using. Right. So those are the IP addresses. We know that the protocol is unknown. And then basically what we could do is if we had the smart PCAP capabilities, oh, excuse me, I hit the wrong one there. We had this one. Click on that particular one. All right, so this is traffic to just that IP address. And if we go ahead and expand that particular one, we can actually come down here, and it was showing a service unknown, but from an event action standpoint, if we had the smart PCAP enabled, we would be able to pull the packet data behind it and be able to determine what exactly that was. But we're not going to make it that easy. Let's go ahead and see what other things we can pull out by just looking at the particular logs, right? So what we can do is we know we had the 42 unique hosts that it was communicating to externally. Well, let's see if it did if any of those addresses actually showed up in any of my DNS traffic. So what I'm going to do here is I've got an embedded search that's going to pull all external hosts for that particular host, and it's going to apply it to the DNS logs, right? And then it's going to pull out what was queried and what the answer was. Right? So the internal is just giving me a list of all of the IP addresses that I communicated with. And then the external is taking that and saying, okay, did any of these IP addresses appear in any query for DNS, right? And it did, one of those addresses did appear. And here's what the query address was when they queried for that particular IP address. And as you can see, right, that's not typically what somebody would type in, right? It's either scripted or it came along with something else.
Yeah, and this is a good point to bring up about DNS in general, right? Is that inside an organization, if you didn't have something like Corelight in your environment, is that you can go to your DNS servers and you'll see logs, and oftentimes you'll see the requests, but you don't see the response, right? So this is a way to get those that request response pairs lined up, and then compare that with other data inside of the environment during an investigation. So this is just, I don't want to say it's a unique capability, but it's a very specific capability to Corelight that makes it very effective when you're conducting an investigation.
Yeah, and so we've looked at what the external connections were. We weren't able to gain too much information into it. It's kind of given us an idea that it was possibly used for exfil, but there was no other communications externally. So what we can do is say, okay, maybe this was a staging host that uploaded the data and it wasn't actually the initial vector. So what we can do is say, all right, we looked at the external host. Let's take a look at what the internal host, what are the internal hosts that it's looking at? And I copied the wrong one. There we go. And as we can see here, internally, this particular host only communicated with the DNS host internally. So it communicated with nobody else. The likelihood of that happening is pretty low, right? More than likely, we may have a gap in our instrumentation. Maybe for this particular segment, we're only catching the traffic at the north-south border, and the external traffic is being caught there. However, we've got no instrumentation going across the east-west, and we're not able to see any of the lateral spread. So at this point here, right, we're kind of up against data that we don't have. We could either pivot into the host data and start looking at it there, right? And the key of this is threat hunting or hypothesis, right? It's something that you think about that you want to be able to either prove or disapprove. And with the data that we have, and then the second piece of that is to making sure that you have enough data to be able to get to a disapproval or approval state. And in this case here, we're kind of in that limbo area. One, because we're not looking at the east-west traffic. If we had that, we could kind of look at, okay, what other internal hosts was this communicating with, and start investigating on those and see what if they were compromised at all.
And to spin this out of control and take it like a further step, is that you can basically take all the artifacts that you learned during this process and then try to apply them another way. So as for an example, we have a DNS request. It came back with a response to an external IP address. We could have looked at the outside address and seen if anybody else had communicated with that in the entire enterprise over a period of time. If we start looking at just that domain and how maybe it's constructed, like if it says server dash whatever, you might be able to use a subset of that, like server just dash and not the IP address, and try to see if you can get a response. You can also take these artifacts and apply them to external technologies and tools like passive DNS systems. Maybe you'll come up with that IP address was reused in other campaigns and be able to tie the knot a little bit around some of the TTPs that maybe that actor used. So this can get very broad very quickly, but as an analyst, you know, you're always asking questions. You're the investigator. You're that cop that's on the beat, if you will. No offense to any police officers out there, that is trying to really uncover what has happened inside the environment, and you can only use the tools that you have and the data at your disposal. So it's really a lot of questions, trying to prove what's going on, trying to understand. But once you've really found something to be of interest, that it's something, we don't know exactly all the details, but it's something, you have to keep pursuing it, right? Because you don't know how far it goes. And something, oh, go ahead, Kulant.
No, go ahead. I'm just going to move over to the trick bot and kind of look at it.
Excellent. That's a great place. So during this discussion, we started to talk about like this investigation or this if you will, your job as an analyst. We're starting with a hunt hypothesis, but the reality is, even if something happened a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago in your environment, and you're just now finding it, you're landing somewhere in the middle of the kill chain process, right? So you're somewhere the attacker had started, could have been 3 weeks ago, but you're looking at what they're doing now. You know, your job is to look left and see how they got in, and look right and figure out how they're maintaining persistence and what are they taking out of the environment. So throughout that entire process, it doesn't matter where you start. We started with a hunt hypothesis here, but it could have been you started with a particular event from your desktop AV, or for an IDS or an IPS rule. It could have been from any direction, but throughout the investigation, you're uncovering, if you will, boulders and pebbles associated with each of the stages or phases of the actual kill chain. So with that, we can dig into a good example, is just TrickBot.
Yeah, so with this TrickBot here, and the whole hypothesis here is, there shouldn't be any self-signed certs in my environment, and I definitely should not be seeing any going externally as well, right? So you're going in, doing a search, and see if you have any self-signed certs going across your network. And as you can see, we did get hits, a lot of them. And not only are they self-signed, we've got some that are on non-standard ports as well. And you've got the internal hosts that are involved listed over here. A good thing is it's only a handful of them. And what we can do is we can start adding in some more data to this and make it a little bit more interesting. And let's say we want to look at the JA3 fingerprinting capability. Right, so these are the fingerprints. You've got the SSL fingerprint for the client side, and then for the server side as well. So typically, this is some data that came out of Salesforce. The guys there did this and figured out that if you hash certain parts of the certificate, you could get a pretty unique identifier that should be able to allow you to identify and fingerprint particular servers, right? So, if you've got multiple hosts out here on the responder side, but the fingerprint is exactly the same. So there's something funny going on here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and pick an IP address to pick on. All right, so we'll go ahead and pick on 10.4.30.101, and we're gonna pivot over to the data exploration tab. And this
So just as to walk through this, what's a good reason for picking on 101? Like looking at the screen, looking at all the items on the screen, what would be a good reason for picking 101? Right? Like look at the ports as an example. You've got the typical things, which are 443. Now you got 449, 447. You start to have diversity there, but you also have a lot of 101s. So it's just somewhere to start. You're going to tease this out. But at the same time, this could have been, you're checking each of them, right? You're digging through each of them.
All right.
Oh, I was expecting you to say exactly, Paul.
Exactly, Paul. Took the words out of my mouth. All right, so this is one of the dashboards that comes along with the Corelight app. And basically, it's data exploration. There's various ones of them. We'll go ahead and kind of just look at files. We're running a little bit tight on time, so we're going to be skipping some steps here. But basically, what we see is when we put in that IP address, we see the various files that were downloaded, right? And we do have an executable that was downloaded, right? So what we can do is kind of dig into that deeper, and we can formulate a query to show me some of the data around that. And we'll look at the actual file itself and see if we can't get some data out of it. Right, so now what I'm doing is I'm pivoting over, searching the files log for any executables as part of the MIME type that the system has dynamically ascertained, and coming from that particular host. And then basically what we're doing is just sorting it by the MD5 hash. And then we're also providing the unique ID. Right, and what we can do is we can actually look at these MD5 hashes and highlight it, do a right click, and we can verify this with a third-party external analysis. Look at buyer's total, and sure enough, it is definitely malware, right?
The malware word. Oh, I'll stop talking because I know we're at the end here, but within malicious code, right, it's often not just one stage. So there's other pieces to this, and VirusTotal provides a lot of artifacts that you can take and then use back in your investigation just by putting them back inside your search query for Splunk.
And what we'll do is I'm going to take a look at that particular file ID and see what data we get back. Right, so that's the actual file itself that was downloaded. And what we can see is, oh, actually, you want
You're gonna get the rest of the logs?
No, it's good. This is
okay.
what I wanted to kind of pull up. Actually, I was going to compare that with what VirusTotal had here underneath the
for that. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So it's a portable executable, as we can see here from a creation time. Right. We got April 30th, 2018, and if we go back here, right, it is giving you that data there, right? The compile time, April 30th, and it matches pretty well with it. And we already shown that the MD5 matches as well. What we can do is, if you look at it, so we're pretty certain that that's part of that campaign. And as Paul was mentioning earlier, we can look at the behavior that was observed with this particular campaign and look at all these IP addresses that this thing is communicating with, right? So we know that that file got downloaded. The next thing is well, did it get executed, right? And we would find that out if there was any kind of communications with these particular IP addresses. So what I'm going to do is just take those IP addresses, put them into the search window. Right, and sure enough, we did have some communications out to it. The good thing is it's only one host. We can see that the country code as well, and it was communicating to it about 41 times. All right, so what we'll do is kind of dig into that particular host and do a search on just that one particular host. And we'll take a look at some of the notices logs, or the notice logs, which is here. Right, and from the notice log, we are seeing some lateral movement as well, right, from that particular host. And this lateral movement here is part of the bizarre set of packages that is developed by MITRE. Right, we can kind of dig into that a little bit more by utilizing its UID and getting a list of what exactly happened on that lateral spread. Right, so this is the certs validation that it did before, and then here's some of the lateral movement that it's highlighting as well. And we've got some files that are being written out to admin shares. So this is that particular host now spreading out laterally to this 10.4.30.5 address. And Paul, did you say you had something to add to that? It seemed like you were.
I was just going to mention, if you're not familiar with the notice framework is the alert mechanism for Bro and Zeek, which is the underlying engine within Corelight, and it's really enacted through a scripting capability. So you can write full Turing complete scripting capabilities into the platform using all of this metadata. That's how the producer-consumer ratio was achieved. That's how the MITRE attack, Bazaar, which is Bro, Zeek, and something, but Bazaar was a tool set they put together as a set of scripts. And there's a whole host of other scripting capabilities that can be used within the platform to identify other behaviors of note when you're conducting your analysis. Go ahead.
All right. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to look at the SMB files and see exactly what was going on, right? So as you recall, we do actually look at east-west traffic. If we're instrumented, we can see all of this data that's going on in the network. So in our previous one, if we were in our previous hunt that we did, if we were instrumented on the east-west traffic, we would have seen similar items like this if there was some lateral movement, right? And as we can see, we've got some files that are being opened at admin shares. We can see what the file that was transferred, right? And what we'll do is we'll look at that particular file. Right, and the good thing is this particular file, it calculated the various hashes. It did a PE extract on it as well. But the other cool thing is it was extracted out. So we were doing file extraction on that particular segment, and we were able to extract it out. So we can actually take a look at that executable and do some analysis on it if we needed to. Now, the other thing is as you recall, we did have and see some RPC traffic. We can dig into that as well. And keep in mind here, right, we're just kind of, at this point, you know, we've got what we needed. Now we're just looking at what other data can we glean off of this without even touching the host at this point. Right.
Awesome. Hey, cool one. I mean, I think we've kind of hit time real quick. I think this might be a good time just to like answer a particular question. So you did say like extraction versus like, well, you said extraction. So what's it mean when it says extraction versus when you don't have an extraction?
Oh, so when you don't have the extraction, that means that the file was not extracted out. So in this case here, we took that binary when it was being sent over the wire, reconstructed it. We did all of our analysis on it, calculating the hashes, and then and all of that gets done in memory. And then when we're finished with it, it does get deleted. But if you've got the file extraction enabled, what it's going to do is it's going to write it out to some storage to, you know, maintain a copy of that traffic that came over. And typically, you know, you probably wouldn't do that on an east-west with executables, but it's possible. That may be more on the north-south side of it. You shouldn't be seeing too many executables coming in and out of your network.
Yeah, got it. I think the key issue was the fact that an extraction was really taking the file, but the data set's still captured no matter what.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Exactly. Okay. Well, I mean, that was the question right there, and I know we hit the time, so I wanted to give it back to Lorenzo, and I just you know, wish everybody a good day.
Cool. Juan and Paul, thank you both for taking the time to join August, Schell, and all of the attendees. I truly appreciate you guys lending your time. To our attendees, if anyone has any follow-up questions or would like to schedule a deeper dive, I'll have Cool Want share. Actually, I'll have an email out to you guys, but I'll give you the points of contact at both August, Schell, and Corelight. In addition, anyone registered for this webinar will be receiving access to an on-demand recording in the next few days, so watch out for that in your inbox. Everybody stay safe, stay sane, and stay sanitized. We look forward to seeing you on our upcoming webinars. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Take care, folks. Bye-bye.